All right, well, I think I'm going to begin. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm sorry I couldn't be here during the board meeting in May. I had a cracked tooth that had gotten infected, so I have a new appreciation of modern dentistry and painkillers. It was some of the most intense pain of my life. So again, my apologies, but there was no way I was going to function appropriately during that day. So good to be healthy and have that tooth out, and good to be here. I thought I'd just say a little bit about, again, what I do. I'm James Russell, Senior Director for Research Support and Assurance for Unizin. In short, I partner and work with members to explore and utilize the UDP for academic and institutional research. I also lead our data services team to help members build information solutions through training, boot camps, hackathons, consultations around R and SQL. I lead our UDP Google Marketplace engagements with prospective clients. And then finally, my other hat is I manage our security and compliance instruments, primarily policy and the supporting documentation behind that policy. So again, thank you for being here. I'm going to move a couple of things over. So today I'm going to talk about the facilitating cross-institutional research. And I'd like to first thank Etienne for a variety of things. And of course, I'm as sad as everyone else is to see him go. He has been instrumental in stewarding my understanding of the UDP in particular, and its elegance and dynamism. And so I'd like to thank him for really conceiving of and building the foundation for the process I'm going to discuss. Additionally, I'd like to thank the Research Advisory Committee for their work in tandem with Etienne in bringing to life what is really an important pillar of Unizin, making available big data to Unizin members through appropriate governance. And then, varied input from others that has been really important and helped us shape this, and it'll continue to be shaped. It is certainly a proof of concept, but this summer we should have practical realization of it and learn quite a bit from how we engage. So please feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I'm happy to kind of turn to discussion. Also happy to entertain questions and comments at the end. So what are we trying to solve in this process of facilitating cross-institutional research? Well, in my view, it's to seamlessly leverage the diversity of big data at scale across member institutions. So if we look at a high level at the unique data that streams to the UDP, potentially millions of events per day, and understand that it is carried out for all member institutions and largely the same way, and that the architecture of the UDP necessarily keeps these data stores isolated from one another. We have the infrastructure and technical foundation for a tremendous amount of learning data, bringing new institutional contexts into play, and that's key to this process if we can employ governance around sharing the data. So I think this is more than just process, it's really governance. What we can now implement, I think, is a process to best exploit the depth and breadth of context and event data that exists in UDP across multiple institutions. So we need a governance that's going to match what we have accomplished through IT infrastructure. A perhaps more functional way to describe this is to standardize and that it make transparent, and transparency is really key to this process as well, the administrative and technical steps in support of original cross-institutional research. And that is among Unizin members, of course. So this governance, in my view, is built on a foundation of three primary elements. Unizin data platform is IT infrastructure, providing a unique set of data services. What can be considered our charge to assist member institutions to conduct research involving the ethical application of student data for improving educational processes and outcomes. and establish general security controls as described in our agreements, upon which this governance that I'm proposing, this model, sits. That is transparent, authoritative, and determined by controls and institutional engagement. And that institutional engagement, again, matched with transparency is key. So, and finally, as a service delivery, we want to operationalize this governance. And that, in my view, operationalization, that's quite a mouthful, involves institutional representation. We want institutions in concert with agreements to have the final word on each use case involving their data. We want to realize the consortium potential around big data. We want to expedite and streamline the process of conducting research to make the UDP as accessible as possible, and to help steward that research through our data services engagements. And I think this is part of the value add, not only the mediating role that I play, but to have our data services team engage with researchers early. And then, of course, to ensure confidentiality at every stage, from agreements to operation. So access to institutional data, both within and potentially between member institutions, is made possible by foundational agreements. And the two that you're, I'm sure, aware of. Our member services agreement entitles a member institution to Unizin's technology solutions, including the UDP, and allows Unizin to collect data on behalf of that institution, establishes Unizin's role as a school official and its rights and roles and responsibilities around accessing and managing an institution's FERPA data. And the data sharing agreement enables Unizin not only to collect that data on behalf of an institution, but share it across member institutions. And really importantly, as part of the due diligence inherent in Unizin's role in this process, the necessity of this governance, I think, is implicated in the spirit of the data sharing agreement. And that is, while the data sharing agreement acknowledges generally an institution's willingness to share their UDP data, the cross-institutional research process allows institutions to vet each request prior to sharing data. And both instruments need to be in place for data sharing to take place. So some key predicates behind this process. First and foremost, Unizin will steward this process between member institutions. So we encourage the formal process of research, whether pre or post-award, and which may or may not lead to formal external funding support, but should lead to publication. It is built on agreements that, again, define Unizin as a school official, a FERPA agent with legitimate need and purpose to access and manage student data for member institutions, the imperatives behind protecting PII. It stipulates that Unizin provides de-identified data for cross-institutional research, for which we have a documented process. Any multi-institutional data set would be generated as a distinct and separate data service, respecting the single tenant architecture. And that Unizin's specific data stewards lead their institution's assessment of the proposed cross-institutional request. So there are 4 phases to this process. 1, to distribute and gather required documentation. So we have a package of information that we would move to researchers or principal investigators. We would submit for review that package to each institution sharing data. We would generate data and data documentation as per the requirements of that research request. And hopefully the result is publication and public celebration, as it were, of the UDP. So what's provided to the researchers in this packet are really 5, but with a 6 request elements. Data requirements template, a data management plan, really a data management plan template or information if external funding is being sought. Unizin Research and Confidentiality Agreement, a cross-institutional data security training document, a contingent approval letter from Unizin, and then finally a request for proof of CITI training. So we begin from Unizin's standpoint. The data requirements template is primary in that it allows us to determine if the data request fits or can be adequately served by the UDP. And I think this is our role and responsibility around this is decidedly data specific. We looked to, of course, have grant name and project name, research analysis plan, discussion of methods, open science framework, project page, perhaps, especially if not associated with the grant proposal. We would have participating institutions listed, and it's very likely that these institutions are represented by the researchers listed as PIs and co-PIs. Unizin contact for data acquisition, in all likelihood that would be me or one of my members of my data services team. A comprehensive description of data required and any custom measures required or gaps identified. So are there specific demographics that might be part of an institution's SIS, for example, or is there a need for course or course numbers to be targeted? And hopefully all leads to Unizin sign off and approval at this very preliminary stage. Next is the data management plan template. If moving toward external funding, as I said, the data management plan template provides all key information for discussion for external funding proposals around the UDP and Unizin's role in the data management. Discussion of UDP learner and learning environment is included there. The contractual foundation for sharing data. Unizin discloses data only for the purposes of the research use case for which the data request has been approved. An outline of security controls is also included. Discussion of UDP's single tenant architecture, application of encryption at every phase of data management, and then de-identification is discussed as well. And then finally, roles and responsibilities in preparing the data set, how data will be formatted, validated, delivered, and identified, or de-identified rather, for example. And all of this underscores, I think, that both the data sharing and confidentiality agreements would need to be signed by member institutions and the researcher, respectively. That's key to each one of these phases. Next is the research and confidentiality agreement. PIs or researchers must agree to comply with privacy rules, commit to public dissemination of research findings, that study courses above a cell cohort threshold so that, for example, no individual student can be identified, and then securely handle all data delivered by Unizin, treating it as confidential information. The cross-institutional data security training was probably the last component that was added to this, and this in particular was brought surfaced by the Research Advisory Committee. And it really is around how do we ensure researchers working within institutions' data are appropriately trained and utilize best practices in the use of the data? And how do we harmonize at the same time different institutional approaches to training around data security so that institutions feel confident that PIs have an understanding of appropriate security controls? So the reality is that Unizin can neither control the local IT infrastructure nor the data security training available within each institution. Some institutions bring together, for example, others bring that kind of institutional security training together in one instrument. Others break it apart in terms of HIPAA and FERPA, acceptable use, user agreements, human resources, etc. So what we want to do is create transparency around data security training at each of the institutions that will be that a PI is part of. We ask researchers first to work with local IT professionals and review appropriate IT policies to secure data, understand what is requested at your institution. And generally, I would say that we would find tremendous harmony across member institutions. Provide an accounting of local IT training or certification, as the aforementioned areas such as HIPAA and FERPA. We list recommended best practices, especially if data is being delivered locally in a local format and not, for example, worked within, analyzed or queried against in BigQuery, for example, in the cloud. And then we steward institutional concerns around local IT policy and data security knowledge. So having Unizin become part of not the decision-making process, but the deliberative process to mediate concerns and help find common understanding around institutional security protocols is another, I think, component of our stewardship. And this mediation, I think, is the most important piece of this process and occurs throughout this process and is central to the service. The contingent approval letter, this is based on review of the previous 4 documents. Unizin will grant contingent approval based on what Unizin is positioned to review, of course, for PIs, researchers to convey to their institutional review boards. And so this requires that IRB approval or exemption be in place, outlines Unizin's role in data delivery, the format, so forth, and expresses expectations again around publication. So in final, after delivering this packet, we should have back from researchers, each of the participating researchers, grant research materials, OSF project page, documents link provided, a Unizin confidentiality agreement signed by each of the researchers, a cross-institutional data security training document completed by each of the researchers, a dataset requirements form, an IRB approval or exemption signed, and then CITI module training links. And so let me just here. So the grant PIs provide Unizin in terms of CITI training with links to the program certifications, demonstrating that their training for the human subjects protection and responsible conduct of research is up to date. So now it's peer institutional review. We take that packet, we now elevate our contingent approval letter to an approval letter and move that to 1 or 2, at least, data steward that is the Unizin appointed data steward for each institution. So key outcomes. Again, we steward the process between PIs, researchers, and institutions. We mediate if necessary, address and help mediate concerns around, for example, keeping institutions anonymous in publication of data, if that is a concern, or are there concerns around data training or methods? Whatever it is, we alleviate the potential confusion and lack of process that may occur if we didn't have Unizin stewarding these process between the Unizin granting of data and the research interests and the institution willing to allow their data to be shared. So hopefully a formal approval from institutions is required, and because of this, all obstacles for cross-institutional sharing data are cleared. Phase 3 is the easy part for us and the most straightforward, the data generation and delivery, data set generation record, queries are logged, record of the member UDP instances, again, within our single tenant architecture is logged as well, record of who executed the queries and the resulting data set, And then data deposit. Data is delivered in an agreed upon format that is part of our data requirements template earlier acquired. And data deposit could be Google BigQuery again, or location, cloud location, or delivered as a CSV. And then finally, the goal and direction: researchers share publications with Unizin and disseminate to participating institutions, perhaps through persistent link through OSF. So in summary, we want to deliver a service that one gives institutions final say on how and when their data is used. We want to remove administrative impediments from this process, provide data services around the modeling and appropriate UDP entities needed for that research. And so we insert data services to steward the actual data management data services component in an early way, and in a way that allows us to bring the full value of Unizin to researchers early, and steward the approval process between PIs, researchers, and institutions. And then, of course, archive and track UDP dependent research and their products. Next steps. We really need to test this process, and hopefully, I think we're on our way, working with Tracy Redding at the University of Nebraska, in particular on her joint top hat, Unizin funded research, to really identify gaps in our workflow, in communication, clarify documentation if necessary. Second is to establish guidelines and best practices with Unizin data stewards, and that's in process. Define roles and expectations that are clearly, so that the review process within the institutional data stewards, that is, those data managers and institutional data stewards that our representatives, some of whom are data stewards, will have a clear idea of how to proceed. And I think in particular around an institution's potential interest in reviewing the research itself, for which the data request is being made. So there needs to be some degree of formal review process in place at each institution beyond data managers or stewards. And it may involve faculty, it may involve others in the community, IT as well. So we're in the process of defining the kind of overarching roles and responsibilities that our appointed data stewards will need to engage in and work through. I think we need to build explicit language within the data sharing agreement around this process, that this is integral to data sharing, is that we have to have both in place. We both have to have a general institutional acceptance that they're willing to share their data. We also have to have this workflow, this governance in place that allows each use case, each research use case to be understood by each lending institution. And then finally, we need to incorporate this process into a separate Unizin policy so that it has the toothiness of policy that we need. So that is, in sum, the cross-institutional research process, and happy to take questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing my documentation here.
This is Lois. I really appreciate the time and the thought and the care that's gone into this. If he's willing, what I'd really like to do is hear James Hilton's take on this.
Thank you, Lois.
James Russell, you're muted.
Yeah, James is
Thank you.
with his computer.
Yeah, James, we can't hear you, but it looks like, okay. looking at your chat.
And for those of you who are newer to our community, James has really been kind of a proponent and a thought leader in the research. Unizin is a research hub space since before Unizin was Unizin, which is why I was calling on him to hear his thoughts.
And he's battling which cameras are actually connected to Zoom, and Zoom refuses to recognize the camera that he uses all the damn time. So hi, everybody. I think it's fabulous. I mean, I think that it's the process that we envisioned from the very beginning, which was how to make sure that we could combine institutional data in ways that institutions stay in control, but minimizes the barriers, that addresses questions of, I mean, I remember when we first started, there were all kinds of questions about FERPA and what you could and couldn't do. And I think all of that has been really addressed. I think for me, what I'm seeing as one of the biggest challenges is getting news about the resource out to researchers. I would love to see 1,000 studies over the next 5 years on this data set, because I think that it is a truly unique data set with all kinds of potential. And then the main question that I have watching the presentation is just how both how effortful and how to reduce the perception of effort there will be for researchers getting access to the data. Like how to just make it a clear, checklist. Just I mean, the researchers who use these kind of data are, of course, used to all kinds of checklists that they have to go through to get access. But particularly since this is not a data, like one of the barriers that I see on our campus is researchers who want to go into this, the first thing that they assume they have to do is build their own custom data set, and often replicating a larger data set that we've already created.
Yeah, and I think that, thank you. I think that's the one of the key benefits of this. The governance and the transparency and the kind of underscoring that institutions control their data and maintain that is getting our data services team connected with researchers early. And so I'm excited about that piece. It formalizes it too, because oftentimes we will, and we're trying to improve this process of communication, we'll get into a project late, or we'll hear about it through other folks, which is great, and that sort of organic evolution of researchers connecting with other researchers and saying, oh, I want to do this project. This provides, I think, a structure to absolutely make sure that our data services team, through that initial understanding of what is appropriate, what data are they requesting, we can already start thinking about how to create SQL queries or how to model it appropriately. And all of those exchanges, I think, are going to be the very first thing that happens. And that, to me, is almost the most important outcome of this, is the dialogue that will ensue.
Yeah, and forgive me if I missed this in the presentation. I mean, one of the things that I started thinking about is how open we are to allowing researchers from non-member institutions to have access to the data. And part of the reason why I'm thinking about that is actually in the wake of in the wake of the moves of edX and 2U in the last week. I think it's really interesting to see what some of the intended and unintended consequences of that venture was. And one of the things that I think edX did well, although I'm too long for this conversation and the emotions are too strong to go into what that move did to the community more broadly. But in the beginning of edX, it really did provide a way to rally researchers, whether they were from edX member institutions or not, I think, into a common space, right? It did provide lift, along with Coursera and FutureLearn and all the others. And so, like, one of the things that I was wondering is, would we be open, how open we are to allowing non-member institutions, researchers, access to the data? And I think I would argue for being really open to it. And in fact, I would love to see a push at something like EDUCAUSE to make the asset really available, because I think that that ability to get access to our data might in fact actually funnel more and more potential members to us, provides all kinds of things. I mean, 2U bought edX because they figured out that free leads to really high paid things later. And then the last thing that I'd say is it also seems to me to be philosophically and ethically the place we wanted to be, which is to facilitate this kind of research. It's great if it's among our institutions, but we want to facilitate the research more broadly. But I don't remember where we all are on that position. And I imagine we don't know where we are on that position, would be my guess.
James, I really like your sentiment of being open. I think that, when you look at other groups that are driving open data sets, it provides the opportunity for us to be a leader in the semantic definition of the kind of data that we want to see people leverage and use. And, really facilitates us, being that leader in that space and really shining a light on what we're doing so well.
I also think it would be a stimulus to researchers on our own campus if they suddenly started seeing other institutions publishing data on things that they should have had first right access to in some ways, right?
And that actually may be an interesting way to couch the position, right? When we pitch it to researchers, is maybe we have an open window where we give them a first right of refusal before we open it up. That may be incentive to get some people to come on board quickly.
In a way to potentially launch this, right? I mean, one can see the particular challenges at the institution level about sharing their data outside membership or outside the consortium, and the advantages. A place to start may be to create something like a Unizin data book that would be able to represent some key entities that are significant in learning data and learning environment data that would be aggregated at the consortium level. So you wouldn't be faced with challenges of institutional identification necessarily. But we could look at learning and learner data represented in some very key areas, tool launches, measures of engagement or activity that, again, would not necessarily target a particular institution, but would start to give a flavor of the richness of data available with the UDP. Again, aggregated at the consortium level. That would be, I think, very indicative of the state of higher education if you look at the cross-section of what Unizin institutions represent of the nation. And I think that might be one way of getting our data out there, not necessarily allowing external institutions, but promoting what's possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really great and I'll quit dominating here in a minute. I think that's a really great pragmatic one. There's a part of me right now, and maybe it's because of the amount of time I've been in this space now. I'm pretty impatient. I actually think higher education is on fire, and I want, and part of the reason for doing the UDP was in fact to allow us to look at questions where you have to know institutional identity, because we're trying to answer questions. Does a curriculum at one place, for example, make a difference? Does the order and sequencing make a difference? What are the successes that some institutions find that others are struggling for? So again, pragmatically, yeah, opening it up in ways that make institutions comfortable are good. On my campus, I'm going to be a pretty strong advocate for keep the regulatory protections in place, but you can't be afraid of what you're going to find. If you do, I'll just point to the last 18 months of people afraid of what they're going to find if they look at data. And so let's not do that. We live in a world where we have to actually believe in that. And now I'll get off my soapbox.
James, one of the things that was coming to mind, and appreciate everything that you put together here. That's really, really helpful to see all of the process components. And I think it's going to be really useful going forward. I've identified 3 departments here at Florida that I want to reach out to about the possibilities here. And one of the things that I need to have, I think, for that conversation is like a 1 to 3 pager that explains not what it is. And so, we say, hey, we all have all this learning tool data out there, Canvas, other tools, blah, blah, blah. But like, what does that really mean? And then the second step for more detailed conversation. So, once we've kind of had that conversation, we start to spread that information around those departments that have mission alignment with the type of data that we're looking at here. And then, of course, there's other, interested, parties around the university, et cetera. We also need to get really specific, like you were talking about with the data book, with data definitions. And kind of that was really brought to the forefront of the conversation with the Dartmouth cheating data issue. And like, that data doesn't mean what you think it means.
That's right.
And we need to be able to have those conversations, not only about Unizin UDP data, but some of the data that we're generating here locally as well, and make sure that when we have those conversations, people don't go down roads thinking, no, this means this thing, when it actually means something really different.
Yeah, agreed. So to your first request, so that would be a pithy couple of pages on what you can do to make sense of learning and learning environments with the UDP. Just that kind of pithy set of information. And then I think the second piece to that would be, if I can summarize the cross-institutional research process in the same way, I would love to get that to accompany that, so that folks not only know, here's what I can do with it in a very, I don't want to take something and make it, I want to simplify it, not make it simplistic. And that's the challenge, right? When you distill something as rich and varied and complex as the UDP. But I think it can be done. And I think if we match then the process of how we can grease the runway for researchers to get to that point, to work with our data services team to make sense, to potentially translate research imperatives to data imperatives, then we've got something that is I think going to have a real power. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, but I just want to thank James for jumping in and helping me think this through while you were responding. I feel really good about what you've done, and I feel ready to walk forward the data sharing agreement on my campus at this point. Just the artifacts we just talked about that can help me explain and answer questions would be really helpful.
Fantastic. Yeah, and that's we're almost done with that, because in that I'm trying to give adequate context to our Unizin appointed data stewards, so they know, okay, here's my charge. Here's what I need to do. If I don't know clearly on campus, here are the folks that I need to seek out to make sure that we have our local governance in place that can make these decisions.
Could you remind, others might need it too, who our data steward is?
Just one second.
Because I got more than one here.
Yeah, let's see. Andy Goldstein.
Oh, okay. Oh, easy.
Yeah.
That's an easy meeting. Excellent. Yeah, I think we're finally at the dream that we talked about whenever it was, James, a long time ago.
Well, and what's exciting to me is that, in a small way, but in a significant way, because we're doubling the size of our team, the data services team, to really bring data into knowledge. And I think that's, if I look at what's happened with ICPSR, which was an example to me because I worked closely with ICPSR for years, is to see their evolution. And I see Unizin's evolution in a very similar way. And that is, it was first, let's get the data in the hands of folks. Let's make data available. And first it was, can we take, we know we have this data, can we take the data and make it actually applicable to applications? So we went from, streams of not even common delimited, just microdata to actual SPSS portable files. to a point where you're actually delivering data on the web through the website. And I think through our engagements with our increased interest in building out data marts that are cross-institutional, that the use cases that we've developed for various members can be translated into useful use cases. Again, looking at course readiness, class engagement, student activity, tool use. All of those are applicable across institutions. So we're moving toward this time where we said, well, run your SQL queries on UDP in any way that you want to. We have these predefined data marts that have already been structured within reporting mechanisms and dashboards that give you immediate information. And that's really exciting to me. I think that's the direction that we're moving and we want to move. And by growing our data services team and not just depending so heavily on Kyle, if you've worked with Kyle, he's amazing. I'm really excited to be able to do more of that. So yes, this is a nice and wonderful complement to that process. Just reading some comments. Yeah. So,
a granular question, slightly granular. Do you anticipate that the data sharing agreement is going to be updated because of all of this, or is the vehicle we have right now standing?
I think when the data sharing agreement was originally conceived, that it was conceived to be enough. And I think this process, is part of that iterative process of refining, and that it's one thing to say, yeah, we're generally comfortable with sharing our data. We understand what data is there. All institutions are within the consortium are buffered and understand the appropriate use, et cetera, et cetera. But I still think that there has to be an individual assessment of every use case, every application. And if we're really going to say, this is your data, Unizin is a mediating facility to take your data and make it accessible, but it never changes the fact that it is your institutional data. We don't do anything to it to change that. We just facilitate its flexibility, its flexible use. Then we have to allow institutions to say, I am comfortable with this particular application or research or data set that's been extracted from my institutional data. I think it makes sense. And I think that's the part that needs to change within the data sharing agreement, is that it implicates this process. And I don't think it's a huge and complex thing to do, but I do think we need to say the data sharing agreement is the regulatory component that has to be in place at the institution level. And now the operational component that enables the data sharing agreement to actually happen is this cross-institutional research process. Well, if there are no other questions, this has been great for me. I really appreciate, and thanks again for being here and on a Friday. For most, it's still morning, but again, I'm sorry I couldn't be at the board meeting, but I'm happy that I'm healthy and pain-free now, and it's really enjoyable to see you all and discuss what has been a kind of a labor of love for a lot of folks, and really put in a lot of effort and thought into it. And I think it's incredibly useful.
Great,
Thank
thank
you
you,
so
and
much.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.